Jan is live at Faithful Fools. It's our second Wednesday hybrid event. Jan is a wonderful poet. She's featured at Sacred Grounds a couple of times over the years and has read in many places, is well known and well regarded. She has a deep perspective and has always been a wonderful feature. She plans to read short stories from her new fiction collection, Ghosts and Oceans, from Zeitgeist Press, which she has right there. I'm looking forward to that. She has published 3 volumes of poetry: The Horizontal Poet, winner of the 2011 Lambda Literary Award, and The Underwater Hospital, 2006, both published by Zeitgeist Press. Both are available on Amazon, and she also has Mixing Tracks, winner of the Gertrude Press Fiction Chapbook Award in 2009. So, a well-established poet, a powerful voice, a good heart, and a soulful singer of the muse. And with that, I am going to mute me, because if I don't do it now, I'll forget. So you're on, my friend, you are on.
Thank you so much, Stan. What a lovely intro. And I always love your intros because they're so thoughtful and they're not like canned bios. And thank you, Elise and Carmen of Faithful Fools, for hosting us here. And thanks, David Airdrag, for running it on this side. I have scripts here for anybody who's hearing impaired. If you're having trouble understanding me through this mask, you can follow along in the script, or you can just grab a book off there and read along. Ghosts and Oceans is my first collection of short stories. I'm going to read one shorter piece called The Christening of Alonso and one longer piece called The Wild Boar Baby. Both are set in the Dominican Republic, where I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I appreciate your forbearance for my reading prose. I hope that you find that it's at least poetic prose. In March of 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella ordered the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the expedition of Christopher Columbus to the Indies. All of Spain's 200,000 Jews were driven out or killed, except for those who converted to Christianity, many of whom continued to practice Judaism in secret. The converted ones were called conversos, or less politely marranos, which means pigs in Spanish. Marrano can also be interpreted as a form of the verb marrar, which means to err or deviate from what is true or right. It's thought that several of the men who sailed on the ships of Columbus in August of 1492 were conversos. On the last day of December of that year, one of those 3 ships was wrecked off the northwest coast of Haiti. The following is dedicated to Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut who was killed in the wreck of the space shuttle Columbia. The Christening of Alonso. The Santa Maria sailed over meadows of seagrass, over mountains and depths her crew could not see but only fathomed. They mapped uncharted seas to rename the Taínos island of Haiti La Isla Española, the Spanish Isle, later written Hispaniola. The Marrano navigator Alonso, who alone had fully appreciated the fantastical quality of the maps in the admiral's quarters, was the only one who didn't cross himself. At the wonders that they found, he had just been baptized the day before they sailed, in a ceremony that had all the religious sentiment of a shotgun wedding. But instead of a groom, Alonso had become the 15th century equivalent of an astronaut. He dropped the surname Ben Abraham and styled himself de la calle, Alonso of the street, like a picaresque hero. Alonso's shipmates and the sailors who followed them traded for spices but sucked sweet mangoes, mined for gold but brought up black coral, hunted for Indian elephants but rode humpback whales home instead. Alonso sharpened a quill from a gull's wing and wrote a letter to his sweetheart that he never sent. I set sail to find you gold, mi tesoro, mi vida, my treasure and my life, but brought you back guanabana seeds and chocolate. The New World's cloth of gold dressed the imagination, not just costuming, but creating the Siglo de Oro, or Golden Age of Spain, in the century that followed. How many mariners sank in the deep green sea, dreaming of the Spanish Isle? Little did Alonso know that the landfall he sighted was no true land at all. The topsoil concealed a cemetery of shell and coral, collapsed into a calcareous mass with subterranean inland seas. Marine caves, tunnels, and underground rivers honeycombed the island's limestone base. Hispaniola breathed water. The island lived like a giant sponge that sucked in Spaniards and spit their bones out onto the ocean floor. Coral would transform the bones of men of Castile and Aragon to castles of aragonite, which would add to the reef, constructing caverns from which someday stalactites would drip calcite drops. 1, 2, 3, a century, a millennium. 500 years after Alonso guided the Santa Maria here, the north coast of Hispaniola is a grave for ships. Steep pinnacles and sheer drop-offs, underwater cliffs and spines, Navidad banks and silver shoals all wait to scrape barnacles off the hulls that glide above. In Samana Bay, whales lift tails that mirror the flukes of the anchors buried on the bottom. The sharks still sing of the mighty feasts their great-great-great-great-grandfathers had when a caravel sank or a man of war foundered. The blood we smelled, the thrashing we felt, the flesh we tore on that day. Catholics tasted a little richer than Protestants, and Portuguese were particularly piquant. 5 centuries after Alonso's voyage, you can't see the ships on the bottom. Pelicans gliding like graceful pterodactyls descry shapes below the surface of the water that harbor more fish. At first, you might think you see a sunken ship, but you soon realize it is only a bale of giant turtles heading for Turks and Caicos Islands. Jellyfish are spectroscopically different just over the wrecks. They refract the water-filled sunlight with a slightly higher index there. Conch shells harvested near sunken galleons trumpet with a characteristic tone. On Christmas Eve, the cabin boy was at the wheel. Some of the sailors were playing tarot and some were throwing dice. The ship's carpenter was teaching Alonso a new game called Primero when the timbers cracked and the reef intruded between the berths. The cursing carpenter sank to his knees with his hand over his St. Christopher medal as the tepid Caribbean water rushed in. Alonso, still not crossing himself, murmured, Yitkadal, Yitkadash. Soon, translucent shrimp would drift through his rib cage and in and out the sockets that had housed his eyes. Bone dice would nestle in his pelvis. Mating lampreys would twine around his spine, and his clavicles would hang across the shank of the 11-foot anchor. If you dive today, you might think you see a Spanish Doña's fan, but it is only a fan of coral. Most likely, you won't find a wreck. You will not see the squid playing slalom in and out of a line of portholes. You will not see encrusted pieces of 8 on the bottom or a corroded astrolabe. You will not find the glass beads and hawk's bells the Spaniards traded for gold rings from Taino noses. Morays will not retreat into cannon mouths or the bioluminescent jellyfish into the captain's Ming pitcher. Instead, the doctorfish, the cobblerfish, and the kingfish will decoy you away from the broken hull and the fallen masts where Alonso walks the streets of his underwater city.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you. So that's a more magical realist story. And this one is really just autobiography called The Wild Boar Baby. Down the streets of the town of Samana in the Dominican Republic, boys like acolytes chanted, "Money, money, peanuts, peanuts," and swung sterno cans glowing holy orange to keep the roasted peanuts warm. In the smaller village of Villa Clara, 10 miles down the road, where kids squeezed fireflies for light, I lived 2 years in a zinc-roofed shack as a Peace Corps volunteer. That afternoon, I lay in a dinghy with Isi, a 5-year-old girl with a cleft palate, and her 2 older brothers. Leonilda and Aridio were purposely rocking the boat to frighten her. She clutched the gunnels and honked like a terrified goose. I told them to stop. Though they didn't seem to feel the shame for which I would have hoped, they stopped, and EC gradually relaxed. The boys began diving off the bow, their laughter spangling off the water like the sunlight. The quay in the middle of the bay looked as if I could reach out and touch it. As I lay in the now gently rocking boat between the sky and the transparent water, watching the boys dive like otters and EC grinning in the stern, I felt that for this moment I was utterly, completely, and perfectly happy. Later that day, in a house downhill from mine, a father whipped his 5-year-old son, Moreno, with a belt for having hit a girl. Oh, I should have set a trigger warning for child abuse and also for death. Sorry about that. The girl in question was feistier than Moreno, and I was fairly sure it wouldn't have occurred to the peaceful, smiling little boy to raise a hand to her unless she had struck him first. I could hear Moreno's hoarse cries, and it took all my self-control not to run out of the house and try to stop the beating. I told myself that the father was correcting the little boy as he had been corrected himself as a child. I told myself to be culturally sensitive and to stay put. My nails were digging into my palms. Juana, Rosa was standing in my doorway. There is a baby dying on the other side of the river, she said. You must come right away. I waded with her across the muddy river to the dwelling on stilts where Benita and her husband lived with their 10 children. It was no larger than the 2-roomed cube in which I lived myself. Once, during my training in one of the slums of the island republic's capital, an epidemic of measles had hit the neighborhood. I was learning to weigh children with a handheld scale along with other health education volunteers. At the first doorway, I heard a sound and stumbled into a 1-room hovel with a single chair sitting in the center of it. In the chair, like a pieta, sat a woman holding a barely conscious child. The child's diarrhea and vomit had covered both his mother and him. The woman looked up at me, but not in an appeal for help. Her eyes were empty of hope, misery making an emptiness that I feared would swallow me as well. There was nothing to do. I backed out of the hut and walked away, filled with guilt, wanting anything but to go back in and see the woman and her moribund child again. Now the scene replayed itself, but with a protagonist whom I knew. Benita's children often came to my house to draw and play with my hair, which seemed to them miraculously straight and soft. In the front room of her house, several women were keeping a vigil of the saddest kind. I walked into the back room to find a tiny baby on the bed, eyes rolled up white, chest heaving as he struggled for breath, lips puckered and limbs flaccid with severe dehydration. His forehead was burning, but his arms and his legs were icy cold. As I put my arm around Benita's shoulders, she started to cry. With your permission, I said, I would like to take him to the hospital. Take him, she said, the tears spilling down the cliffs of her face. I turned to Rosa, who was some kind of cousin of Benita's, and asked her if she knew how to ride behind on a motorcycle, not hembra or side saddle, but macho, astride. She nodded. She said she'd put on a full skirt with shorts underneath. I told her to meet me with the baby on the road in 5 minutes, and I went to get my extra helmet. When we got to the hospital, Rosa thought for a minute that the child was dead, but I took him from her and felt that he was breathing. Holding the child to my chest, I ran into Emergencia and almost straight into Candido, my friend and the head of public health for the town and the surrounding villages. Búscame un médico, I said abruptly, unintentionally using the familiar command form. Find me a doctor. Good morning, he answered stiffly in English. I squeezed his shoulder in apology for my rudeness. Se muere el niño, I whispered. The child is dying. A glance at the wizened form in my arms had already told him that. He shot Rosa a look of compassion and led us to Dr. Alvarado's bedroom in the back. I laid the baby on the bed. Alvarado was smoking. He kept blowing smoke into the baby's face as he examined him. Who let the child get into this condition? He demanded. The doctors always proudly spoke English to me. Alvarado pinched the skin of the baby's stomach, which had lost all its elasticity and didn't recoil into place right away as it should have. Dr. Calderon came in and leaned over the bed. He is severely dehydrated, she said. Go to the pharmacy on the corner and buy us 2 butterfly needles, maripositas they're called. Also get an IV duct and a syringe. The hospital had been built with World Health Organization money, but there were no supplies, not even for emergencies. The patients had to buy their own. The doctors were all interns on their obligatory year of national service after university. They were paid so little that they had to live in the hospital call rooms. They pierced him all over, first the backs of his hands, then the feet, then the crown of his head. Finally, they got a line into his groin and started running the fluid into him. The tiny shriveled body in the bed filled up like a water balloon, expanding into a gurgling baby before my eyes. Everyone around the bed began to cheer, smile, clap each other on the shoulders, and to pound my back too, laughing in triumph. Later that night, I ate dinner with Kika, the curandera or healer who lived next door to me. She told me I had missed something about Benita's youngest child. That child will be an idiot, said Kika. His mother saw a wild boar while she was pregnant, and it gave her a susto, a fright. That's why the baby came out looking like a pig. He will never become more than a vegetable, a moron, that child. I stared at the fire. A piece of rotted wood thrown into the flames spewed out a shower of living sparks, winged termite-like insects caught in their own holocaust. One of them crawled, still burning, toward my toe. I shoved it back towards its immolated companions. After dinner, I drove the baby's mother's side saddle behind me to the hospital. I took her to the child's ward, where she kissed and fussed over the infant. Only then did I notice the epicanthal folds of the baby's eyes. Like a palm reader, I opened the baby's loose fist and saw across the palm a single simian crease. Of course, with 10 children to feed, they'd been letting the youngest child, who they knew had Down syndrome, be carried off by diarrhea. Probably the father had insisted, but at the last moment, the mother had been unable to go through with it and had sent Rosa to me. Or maybe Rosa had come on her own, and once I was there, the mother had let things take their course, had let me take my course. I, like a hurricane sweeping through, had thought I was the answer to their prayers, the deus ex machina who would save their child. I drove back to Villa Clara and fell asleep with difficulty. It could only have been a few hours later that I was awakened by an ululation, a keening cry that sent me scurrying into my clothes and out my back door. There was Benita, with bare and muddy feet, crying that she had awakened in the hospital to find the child dead in her arms. She had walked the 10 miles back to arrive at the village at dawn. She wanted me to bring her baby's body back to her. She asked me to take pictures of him so she could remember him. I brought her husband to the hospital on the back of my motorbike to claim and carry the child. Dr. Calderon at the hospital was very angry. She suspected the mother of smothering the child, although she said that such babies had weak hearts, so there was some chance the mother's story was true. She didn't want to sign the death certificate because she wasn't sure about the cause of death. All the father cared about was getting the hospital to bury the child. He thought that way he could save the cost of the funeral and burial. Calderon got even angrier and said he would have to take the body away. When I went to photograph the dead child, the ants had already gotten to him. Over and over again, I had to brush them from his cheek to make the picture turn out well, but they kept coming back. I snapped the photo. Blood turned to garnets, teeth turned to pearls, tears to rain on a zinc roof. Angelito, Angelito, you will never swing a sterno can like a censer and cry, Mani, Mani. Your father will never beat you for hitting a girl. You will never leap from the bow of a boat between a perfect sky and sea. You will never catch a susto from a wild boar crossing your path. You will never grow up to be an idiot. Thank you.
You have 3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you have a little
Well-
time.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that you guys can stay in touch with me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Ghosts and Oceans is available on Amazon and directly from the publisher at Zeitgeist Press, which is zeitgeist-press.com. like. Thank you so much. Can't wait to hear the open mic.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Give her a round of applause. Unmute, ladies and gentlemen. That's
Thanks so much. Thanks for the
beautiful,
opportunity.
beautiful work. I mean, you know, trigger warnings, yes, but still wonderful.
I so appreciate the chance to read it for you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Wow.